I, 37M, have been married to my wife, Sarah, 35F, for nearly 10 years. We met in college, fell in love quickly, and built what I thought was a solid life together. We have 2 kids, Liam, 9M, and Emily, 7F, a nice house, and honestly, I thought we had a decent marriage. Sure, we had our ups and downs like any couple, but I never imagined that she would betray me like this. A few months ago, everything started to unravel. It was a Thursday evening, and I was driving back from work, the sun just setting behind the city skyline. I decided to take a different route home and found myself passing a cozy Italian restaurant that Sarah and I used to love. As I glanced inside, something caught my eye, a familiar silhouette, her long dark hair and that laugh I could recognize anywhere. She was sitting with a guy who looked too close to her, their hands intertwined across the candlelit table. At first I thought, no, it can't be. But then, as I slowed down, it became clear. It was Sarah, smiling like she hadn't in years. My blood ran cold, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel. But instead of confronting her right away, I decided to keep my cool. I pulled over a few blocks away, took a deep breath, and made a decision. I needed to figure out what was going on, and more importantly, how to make sure she wouldn't see this coming. I knew that if I played my cards right, I could turn the tables on her. So, I reached out to a couple of my friends, Mike, 36M, my best friend since high school, and Rebecca, 34F, an attorney I knew from work. They agreed to help me dig deeper and get my plan in motion. We'd start gathering evidence, texts, photos, and anything else that might come in handy later on. Little did Sarah know, this was only the beginning. After that night, I couldn't shake the image of Sarah with that guy from my head, but I kept my emotions in check. I didn't say anything to her when I got home, just acted like everything was normal. She greeted me with a smile, and I kissed her cheek, pretending that I hadn't just seen her holding hands with another man. I knew that if I confronted her too early, it would ruin everything. The next day, I met up with Mike and Rebecca in a small coffee shop on the outskirts of town. I told them everything I had seen, and Rebecca, being the no-nonsense lawyer she was, immediately suggested that I start documenting everything. If you want to win this, you'll need evidence. Trust me, the courts won't care about feelings. They care about proof, she advised, her voice firm. Mike was all in too. He had always been fiercely loyal to me, and he was furious at the thought of Sarah sneaking around behind my back. We'll get her, man. She won't see it coming, he promised, slapping me on the back. We devised a plan. Mike would follow her when I couldn't, while Rebecca would help me prepare for the legal side of things. Over the next few weeks, Mike and I took turns trailing Sarah. We found out that her lover was her high school friend, a guy named Greg, 35M. They had apparently reconnected a couple of years ago through social media, and their friendship had turned into something much more. I even managed to get a few blurry photos of them together, laughing and looking way too close for comfort. It turned my stomach, but I kept reminding myself that it would all pay off in the end. I started distancing myself from Sarah at home, keeping my interactions with her as brief as possible. I could see her noticing the change, but she never brought it up, probably because she was too busy sneaking around with Greg to care, and that suited me just fine. Little did she know, every move she made was playing right into my hands. Rebecca started drafting the paperwork, preparing for the divorce. But we weren't going to file just yet. Not until everything was perfectly in place. This was about more than just ending the marriage. I was determined to come out on top, and I had a feeling Sarah wouldn't take that lightly. But what Sarah didn't realize was that I had more allies than she knew, and they were all helping me build a case that would turn her world upside down. And honestly, watching it all unfold was the only thing that kept me going during those sleepless nights. As the weeks rolled on, my act of pretending to be the clueless, doting husband started to pay off. Sarah seemed oblivious to the fact that I was catching on to her little charade. She continued meeting Greg, thinking she had me wrapped around her finger. But I kept my head down, following Rebecca's advice, building my case piece by piece. Mike and I made it a routine. He'd follow Sarah on her girls' nights out, which I knew now were actually dates with Greg. Sometimes, I'd take over when I had time, watching from a distance as they met up in bars or walked hand in hand along the waterfront. My heart clenched every time, but I held on to the thought that soon, this would all be over. One night, I managed to record a conversation between Sarah and Greg as they left a bar. I sat in my car, parked nearby, my phone recording every word. They laughed about how clueless I was, and Sarah even joked that I'd never suspect a thing. Greg, in his cocky tone, reassured her, saying that soon they'd be able to live the life they always dreamed of. I saved that recording with a cold smile on my face. It was all starting to come together. Meanwhile, Rebecca helped me shift our finances around subtly, putting away savings into an account Sarah couldn't touch. She also found a way to adjust the ownership of our home and cars without arousing suspicion. Turns out, Sarah had never bothered to learn about these legal matters, leaving Rebecca and me plenty of room to maneuver. I even started moving some of my personal items out of the house, hiding the fact that I was slowly preparing for my exit. As I gathered evidence, I noticed Sarah starting to act differently too. She'd been dropping hints about wanting a change of scenery, suggesting that maybe we should take a break or sell the house and move somewhere else. It was clear she was gearing up to leave me for Greg, thinking she'd walk away with a nice settlement. Little did she know, the rug was about to be pulled out from under her. One evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, I sat down with Rebecca and Mike, laying out all the evidence we had gathered so far. Photos, text messages, recordings, financial documents, it was all there, a neat little pile of proof. Rebecca nodded approvingly as she sorted through everything. "This is more than enough to turn the tide in your favor," she said, her voice full of conviction. "When we go to court, she's going to be in for a nasty surprise." We spent hours that night strategizing, figuring out how to use everything we had to our advantage. Mike suggested bringing in a private investigator he knew, just to make sure we hadn't missed anything. I agreed there was no room for error. It was almost funny how methodically we were planning this, like a business deal rather than the collapse of a marriage. But I didn't feel guilty, not after everything she'd done behind my back. All I felt was a cold determination to make sure she wouldn't take anything from me when she finally decided to leave. It was time for her to learn that actions have consequences, and those consequences were going to be a lot harsher than she could ever imagine. The stage was set, the pieces were moving into place, and the clock was ticking down to the moment when I would finally pull the trigger on everything we'd prepared. Little did Sarah know, the perfect life she thought she was building with Greg was about to come crashing down. A few weeks later, things started to speed up. Sarah had become bolder in her secret life, spending more time away from home and coming up with flimsy excuses about why she was late. She'd claim she was with friends or that she had a work emergency. But I knew better. I'd already seen her cozy dinners with Greg and watched as they'd leave bars together, disappearing into the night. But I continued to play my role, the husband too wrapped up in work and his own world to notice anything. I even started buying her flowers occasionally, like I was trying to salvage a marriage that was already a sinking ship. It was all part of the act, and it seemed to be working. Sarah would give me those awkward, guilty smiles every time, clearly uncomfortable with my sudden show of affection. She had no idea that every move I made was designed to catch her off guard when the time came. Meanwhile, Mike's friend, the private investigator, let's call him John, 42M, turned out to be a real asset. He managed to track Sarah and Greg to a weekend getaway they'd taken under the guise of a work conference. John had gotten some incredibly damning photos of them together, sharing a hotel room and sneaking around the resort like a couple of teenagers. When he handed me the pictures, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. It was all so predictable, really. With the photos, recordings, and text messages in hand, Rebecca and I set to work filing for divorce. But we weren't just going for a clean split. We were making sure that Sarah would end up with as little as possible, no house, no car, and no custody of the kids. Rebecca explained that, given the evidence of Sarah's infidelity, we could leverage it to argue that she wasn't fit to provide a stable environment for Liam and Emily. It was a tough angle, but we had a solid shot. As we prepared the paperwork, I started to shift my behavior with Sarah. I became colder, less responsive, and started sleeping in the guest room. It was subtle, but it made her uneasy, and I could see the worry growing in her eyes. She asked me one night if everything was okay between us, if I was feeling distant. I just shrugged and told her I was tired from work. She didn't press further, probably too wrapped up in her affair to really care. But the most satisfying part came when Sarah herself started to slip. One night, she came home a little tipsy, probably from one of her dates with Greg. She stumbled into the kitchen, mumbling something about how she deserved better and how she was stuck with someone who didn't even appreciate her. I played dumb, asked her what she meant, and she just waved me off, heading upstairs. But I made sure to write it all down, adding it to my growing arsenal of evidence. Behind the scenes, I started preparing Liam and Emily for the change that was coming. I didn't want to lie to them, but I knew they needed to understand that things between their mom and me weren't going to stay the same. I told them in simple terms that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes it means living apart. Liam, being older, seemed to understand a little better, though I could see the confusion in his eyes. Emily just clung to my leg, not really understanding, but sensing the tension in the air. The kids were the only reason I had any reservations about the plan. But every time I thought about pulling back, I'd remind myself of all those nights Sarah had spent with Greg, lying to my face without a shred of remorse. She'd already checked out of this family, leaving me to pick up the pieces. So I pressed on, knowing that soon the tables would turn. As I headed to bed that night, I glanced over at Sarah, sleeping soundly with no idea that her world was about to change forever. It was strange. After everything I had discovered, I didn't even feel anger anymore, just a cold satisfaction, knowing that she wouldn't get away with this. The day I filed for divorce was a turning point. Rebecca had drawn up all the papers, and we made sure to file everything quietly, without alerting Sarah. By the time she would be served with the papers, every loose end would be tied up, and she'd have nowhere to hide. It was all part of the plan. Hit her when she least expected it, with everything perfectly in place. But before that, I wanted to do one last thing. I decided to let Greg know that I was onto them. I wasn't planning on a confrontation, but I wanted him to feel the heat. It just so happened that Greg worked at a nearby real estate office, and one afternoon, I stopped by. I walked in, keeping my composure, and asked for Greg by name. When he came out from his office, his face turned pale the moment he saw me. "Hey, Greg," I said with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Just thought I'd drop by and see how things are going." He stammered, clearly not expecting to see me. Yeah, things are good. How about you?" I leaned in a little, lowering my voice just enough to make sure he felt the weight of every word. "You know, it's funny. I think we both know a little secret. But don't worry, it'll all come out soon enough." His face flushed red, and he mumbled something about being busy before practically sprinting back to his office. I left the building with a small sense of satisfaction, knowing that I had planted a seed of panic in his mind. It was just a taste of what was coming. That night, Sarah seemed a bit more on edge than usual, probably sensing that something was brewing. She kept glancing at me during dinner, as if she was waiting for me to say something. But I stayed calm, even asked about her day, like nothing was wrong. It was almost funny, watching her squirm as she tried to gauge whether or not I knew about her little secret. The next morning, Rebecca arranged for Sarah to be served with the divorce papers while she was at home, thinking it was just another typical day. I made sure to take the kids out for breakfast, keeping them away from the scene. As we were sitting in a local diner, I got a text from Rebecca. "It's done." Back at the house, Sarah was in shock when the process server handed her the envelope. I can only imagine the look on her face when she read through the papers and realized that I had not only filed for divorce but also for full custody of the kids and exclusive ownership of the house. And that wasn't even the worst part. Attached to the paperwork were copies of all the evidence I had gathered: photos, text transcripts, recordings. It was all there, a detailed record of her infidelity and deceit. When I returned home with the kids, Sarah was waiting for me in the living room, her face flushed with anger and panic. She waved the papers in my face, shouting, "What the hell is this, John? You're divorcing me?" I shrugged, keeping my expression cold. "I think the evidence speaks for itself, Sarah. I know about Greg. I've known for a long time." She froze, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. She tried to backtrack, claiming it wasn't what it looked like, that she could explain everything. But I didn't let her. "Save it for the court, Sarah. I've got everything I need." She looked like she was going to argue, but then she spotted the folder on the table with all the photos and recordings. Her face went pale as she realized just how deep I had dug. She snatched up the folder, flipping through it, her hands shaking. The photos of her and Greg at the hotel, the recordings of their conversations, it was all there, laid out in front of her. "I thought you loved me," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. But I didn't feel a shred of sympathy. Not anymore. "Funny, I thought you loved me too, Sarah. But clearly I was wrong." I turned away and walked upstairs, leaving her standing in the living room, clutching the evidence of her own betrayal. For the first time, she was the one who didn't have the upper hand, and I could see the realization sinking in. The game had changed, and she was no longer in control. And this was only the beginning of her fall. The days following the delivery of the divorce papers were tense. Sarah's facade of confidence shattered quickly. She spent hours pacing around the house, calling friends, and probably trying to figure out a way to spin the story in her favor. But deep down, she knew she was cornered, and the anger I had seen in her eyes was slowly morphing into desperation. One afternoon, after I had returned home from work, I found Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, her head in her hands. The kids were at a friend's house, and the house felt eerily quiet. As I stepped into the kitchen, she looked up, and I could see that the fire in her eyes had dimmed. "John, we need to talk," she said, her voice cracking. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "What's there to talk about, Sarah? You've made your choices, and now you're facing the consequences. Please, just listen to me for a second," she pleaded, her tone shifting from angry to desperate. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just confused, and Greg, he made me feel alive again." "Alive?" I echoed, incredulous. "You think lying and sneaking around makes you feel alive? You betrayed your family, Sarah." "I know I messed up," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "But I want to fix this. We can work through it together. I promise. I can end things with Greg. Just give me a chance." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was a classic case of trying to salvage a sinking ship with duct tape. "And what? Go back to pretending everything is fine? You think I can just forget about what you did?" She jumped to her feet, her voice rising again. "So what? You just want to take everything from me? Is that it? You think this is some kind of game?" I stepped closer, my expression steady. "This isn't a game, Sarah. You chose to throw away our marriage for a fling, and now you want me to feel sorry for you? That's not how this works." She broke down again, but this time it felt different. There was a realization dawning on her. This was no longer about salvaging our relationship. It was about her survival. "What do you want from me?" she sobbed. "I'll do anything. Just please don't take the kids away." That hit hard. I'd always thought of myself as a fair person. I didn't want to tear her away from our children, but I couldn't ignore the fact that she had put them in jeopardy with her actions. "I want what's best for them, Sarah. And right now, I don't think that's you. You've been emotionally absent, and you're not the same person I married." In that moment, I saw her crumble, the anger replaced with genuine fear. But it wasn't my problem anymore. I had to think of Liam and Emily first. I wanted them to have a stable environment, and that was not with a mother who was juggling lies and infidelity. As I turned to leave the kitchen, I heard her voice again, this time softer, more vulnerable. "John, please, if you care about our family at all, let's at least try counseling. For the kids' sake." I paused at the doorway, considering her words. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the damage was too deep. "You should have thought of that before you started sleeping with Greg," I replied coolly. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about the kids, and I won't put them through the pain of watching us pretend." She slumped back down into her chair, the fight gone from her. I could see the defeat washing over her, and it felt surreal. This was the woman who had once been so confident, so sure of herself, and now she was just a shell of that person. But I couldn't let myself feel guilty. I had a plan, and I was going to follow through. Rebecca was waiting on the next steps, and I had to focus. As I walked away, I felt a mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, but mostly a sense of relief. The first part of my plan was complete. I had finally taken the first step toward reclaiming my life. But I had to admit, I was curious about what Sarah would do next. Would she dig her heels in and fight back? Or would she spiral further down the rabbit hole? Only time would tell, but I was prepared for whatever came my way. This was just the beginning, and I was determined to come out on top. The following weeks were a whirlwind of chaos as the divorce proceedings kicked into high gear. Sarah, initially caught off guard, quickly shifted gears from denial to defense mode. She started reaching out to her friends, particularly the ones who had been complicit in her affair, trying to gather support and plot her next move. Little did she know, I had already anticipated this. One evening, as I sat in my home office, reviewing the case file with Rebecca, I received a text from Mike. "Hey, I think Sarah's getting desperate. She's meeting with some friends tonight. Sounds like they're planning something big." I leaned back in my chair, intrigued. This could either be a stroke of luck or just another piece of the puzzle. "Mike's keeping an eye on her," I told Rebecca. "Looks like she's gathering her troops for some kind of retaliation." Rebecca smiled, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Perfect. We can use whatever they come up with against her. If they're plotting, it shows she's panicking, which only strengthens our case." I nodded, feeling a renewed sense of determination. Let's keep an ear to the ground. I want to know everything they're discussing. If she thinks she can play games with me, she's sorely mistaken. Later that night, while the kids were at their friend's house for a sleepover, I made my way to the local bar where Sarah's friends often gathered. It wasn't a place I frequented, but it was familiar enough to blend in. As I walked in, I spotted Sarah seated in a booth with 3 of her closest friends, including Jenna, the one who had always encouraged her reckless behavior. They were huddled together, their voices low but animated. I found a spot at the bar where I could eavesdrop without drawing attention. As I sipped my drink, I listened intently, catching snippets of their conversation. "I can't believe he's doing this to you, Sarah. You need to fight back," Jenna said, her voice laced with indignation. "I know, but he has all this evidence. It feels like I'm being cornered," Sarah responded, her tone strained. "Cornered?" Another friend chimed in. "You need to turn the tables on him. Use his emotions against him. Make him look unstable. He's the one who's been keeping secrets." I could barely contain my smirk. So they were plotting a counterattack. I could see this going one of 2 ways. Either they would escalate and make a bigger mess for Sarah, or they would fall flat, further sealing her fate. Either way, I had the upper hand. As the night wore on, I decided to leave before I was noticed. I slipped out the back door and headed home, my mind racing with the possibilities. If they were going to come at me with accusations of instability, I had to prepare myself. I called Rebecca and filled her in on what I'd overheard. "Looks like Sarah's trying to come up with a strategy," I said. "We need to stay a step ahead." "Absolutely," she replied, her voice steady. "I'll dig into her social media and see if she's posting anything that could backfire on her. If she's trying to create a narrative, we need to counter it with facts." The next few days were filled with meetings, strategizing, and gathering even more evidence. I even enlisted Mike to help gather any potential witnesses who could testify to Sarah's unfit behavior as a mother. He knew the local community well and quickly found a few people who had observed her partying and being reckless over the years. But Sarah wasn't going down without a fight. In the days that followed, she tried to play the victim in front of friends and family, portraying me as the heartless husband who was out to destroy her life. I was receiving calls and messages from concerned friends, asking what was going on. But I remained calm, explaining that there was much more to the story than she was letting on. Every conversation I had only reinforced my resolve. If Sarah thought she could manipulate the narrative and gain sympathy, she was in for a rude awakening. The truth was on my side, and I had the evidence to prove it. On the morning of the first court hearing, I walked into the courthouse with Rebecca, my heart pounding but my head clear. I knew this was just the beginning, and I was ready to face whatever Sarah had planned. She may have thought she could twist the situation to her advantage, but the truth would prevail. And as the doors opened, I felt a surge of determination. I was ready for war, and I was going to win. The courtroom was bustling with energy as I took my seat next to Rebecca. I glanced around, spotting Sarah sitting on the opposite side with her attorney, a slick man named Derek, who had a reputation for being cutthroat. The tension was palpable as the gavel banged, signaling the start of proceedings. I had prepared for this moment, and I was determined to stand my ground. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman in her late 50s. She glanced at both parties before stating, "We're here today to discuss the custody arrangement and the divorce filing. I expect both parties to maintain decorum in this courtroom." I felt a slight shiver of anxiety, but it quickly faded as I reminded myself of the facts I held. Derek stood up first, addressing the court. "Your Honor, my client Sarah is here today to contest the divorce filing initiated by her husband, John. She believes that the evidence presented by Mr. John is not only misleading but intended to tarnish her character." I clenched my jaw, ready to rebut. Derek continued, "Sarah has been a dedicated mother and a loving wife. This sudden move by John has left her feeling blindsided and defensive." As he spoke, I noticed Sarah's face flushed with a mixture of anger and fear. She was trying to put on a brave face, but I could see the cracks starting to show. When it was my turn, I stood up, my voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, I'm here to present evidence of Sarah's infidelity and her unfitness to have primary custody of our children. I believe that my children's welfare is my utmost priority, and this evidence demonstrates that Sarah's actions jeopardized our family." I handed over the folder of evidence to the court clerk, who passed it to the judge. As she flipped through the pages, I could see the judge's expression change. It was subtle, but I could sense her growing disapproval of Sarah's behavior. "Let's start with the custody arrangement. What are your proposals?" the judge asked, looking between us. I took a deep breath, preparing my statement. "I propose that I receive full custody of Liam and Emily. Sarah has shown a pattern of neglect and emotional instability due to her choices. I believe that providing a stable home for them is paramount." Derek jumped in quickly. "Your Honor, I contest this. John has been emotionally distant and has taken steps to alienate Sarah from their children. He is not a perfect parent himself." "Please elaborate on what you mean by that," the judge replied, her tone stern. Derek tried to pull me into the mud, stating that I often worked late and had been absent during critical family moments. But I was ready for that. "I acknowledge I've been focused on my career, but I've never been absent from my children's lives. I was always there for their milestones, and I have evidence of my involvement in their activities, including school events, sports, and family outings. Meanwhile, Sarah has been emotionally unavailable and has put herself first." I could feel the judge's gaze sharpen as I laid out the facts. The evidence I had provided showed Sarah at parties, ignoring the kids' needs. I had printed photos from social media, with dates clearly marked, illustrating her absence during important family events. As I spoke, I noticed Sarah's demeanor change. Her confident facade was crumbling, and I could see the flicker of fear in her eyes. She had hoped to manipulate the narrative, but the cold, hard facts were beginning to catch up with her. The judge then turned her attention to Sarah. "Ms. Turner, how do you respond to these claims?" Sarah stood up, trying to reclaim her composure. "Your Honor, I was just having a rough time. I love my children dearly. I made mistakes, but I can be a good mother. I can prove it." The judge raised an eyebrow. "And how do you intend to prove that? You've been living in a pattern of behavior that contradicts your statements. This court needs more than words." For the first time, Sarah faltered. She stammered through her defense, but the judge wasn't buying it. It was clear she was losing ground, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The evidence was stacking against her, and my resolve was only getting stronger. After several hours of back and forth, the judge finally called for a recess. As we stepped outside the courtroom, I caught Sarah trying to speak to her friends. "I can't believe he's doing this to me," she yelled, her voice rising. "He's lying. I'm not the bad guy here." But the words were falling on deaf ears. I could see that even her friends were looking at her with a mix of concern and disbelief. They had known her for years, and the reality of the situation was becoming too apparent. As we returned to our seats, Rebecca turned to me with a grin. "You did well in there. Keep it up, and she'll hang herself with her own words." I nodded, my heart racing with adrenaline. I knew this was just the beginning, and I had to keep my focus. The next court date was coming up soon, and I was prepared to give it everything I had. Sarah was unraveling, and I was ready to capitalize on every misstep she made. But as the day progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was plotting something in the background. I could see the determination in her eyes, and I knew she wouldn't give up easily. Whatever she had planned next, I was ready to face it head-on. As the days turned into weeks, the courtroom saga unfolded like a gripping drama. With each hearing, Sarah's facade began to crumble further, and her attempts to manipulate the narrative only served to backfire. Rebecca and I worked diligently, gathering more evidence and witnesses to solidify our case. One afternoon, after a particularly tense hearing, I received a call from Mike. "Hey, I heard some interesting news about Sarah. She's been out with Greg again. They were seen at that bar you mentioned," he said, his tone a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "Really?" I leaned back in my chair, a smirk creeping onto my face. "She's that reckless? I thought she'd be laying low." "Apparently not. I thought you'd want to know." "It's definitely not going to help her in court," Mike replied. I hung up the phone, considering my next move. This was an opportunity one couldn't pass up. If I could catch her in the act again, it would only further prove her negligence and emotional instability. I decided to put a plan into action. The next evening, I gathered my courage and drove to the bar where Mike had spotted her. I parked across the street and waited. It wasn't long before I saw Sarah walk in, her head held high, as if she had nothing to hide. A wave of anger surged through me, but I reminded myself that I needed to stay calm and collected. I couldn't let her see me. I watched as she mingled with friends, but my focus was on her interactions with Greg. They laughed and leaned in close, the chemistry palpable even from a distance. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a casual encounter. It was an emotional affair that was still very much alive. After a while, I decided to step out of the car and approach the entrance. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what lay ahead. I entered the bar, immediately spotting Sarah and Greg at the back, sharing a booth. I kept my distance, hiding behind a pillar, trying to remain inconspicuous. As I observed them, I overheard snippets of their conversation. "I can't believe he's fighting me like this," Sarah said, her voice tinged with frustration. "He's not going to take my kids from me. I'll fight him with everything I've got." Greg leaned in closer, offering a smirk. "You'll figure it out. You always do. Just don't let him get to you. He's trying to make you look bad." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Here she was, actively plotting against me with her affair partner, yet she had the audacity to act like the victim in court. I felt a mix of anger and determination wash over me. I needed to gather proof of this conversation, but I couldn't risk being seen. I quietly retreated to the bar and asked the bartender if I could borrow a phone charger. He handed me one, and I discreetly set my phone to record. I moved back to my hiding spot, my heart racing as I focused on capturing their conversation. "I'll just tell the judge that you've been working all the time and that you're not around for the kids," Sarah continued. "They'll see that I'm the one who's there for them, the one who actually cares." I fought the urge to storm over and confront her. This was too valuable. If I could present this evidence in court, it would be the nail in her coffin. The more I recorded, the more it became clear that Sarah was willing to destroy her own credibility to manipulate the situation in her favor. As the night dragged on, I finally heard enough. I slipped out of the bar, feeling a rush of adrenaline. I couldn't wait to meet with Rebecca and share what I had captured. This would surely turn the tide in my favor. The next day, I met with Rebecca in her office. I played the recording for her, and her eyes widened as she listened. This is gold, John. We need to present this in the next hearing. It shows premeditated deceit on her part. I agree, I replied, my confidence growing. This is more than just evidence. It's proof of her intentions to manipulate the situation for her gain. The day of the next court hearing arrived, and I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety. As I took my seat, I noticed Sarah's demeanor had changed. She seemed nervous, glancing around the room as if she sensed that something was amiss. When the judge called us to order, I could see the tension building. Derek stood up, ready to defend Sarah. But I was ready with my bombshell. Your Honor, I'd like to present new evidence that highlights my wife's intentions and actions regarding our custody case, I said, handing over the recording to the judge. As she listened, I could see her expression shift from curiosity to shock. After the recording finished, the judge looked at Sarah, her eyes narrowed. Ms. Turner, can you explain this conversation? Sarah opened her mouth to speak but found no words. Panic spread across her face as the weight of her deceit began to sink in. She glanced over at Derek, who looked equally dumbfounded. Your Honor, she finally managed to stammer. Save it. The judge interrupted, her tone no nonsense. Your actions here today have serious implications, and it appears you have attempted to manipulate the court and your husband. This is unacceptable behavior. As the judge continued to lay down the law, I felt a rush of satisfaction. I had outmaneuvered Sarah at her own game, and it was finally becoming clear to everyone in the courtroom who the real villain was. When the session concluded, I stepped outside the courtroom, my heart racing. Rebecca joined me, her face lit up with excitement. You did it, John. This is a huge victory. I can't believe it worked, I said, a grin spreading across my face. But I know she won't take this lying down. We need to prepare for her next move. Little did I know, Sarah was already plotting her comeback. As I turned to leave, I noticed her talking to a group of her friends outside the courthouse, looking more determined than ever. I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight, and I was ready for whatever she had planned next. As the weeks rolled by, the courtroom battles became a regular part of our lives, each session more intense than the last. Sarah, now fully aware that the tide had turned against her, was growing increasingly desperate. With each failed attempt to manipulate the narrative in her favor, her demeanor transformed from confident to erratic, and I could sense her resolve faltering. In our next court session, Sarah arrived looking disheveled and anxious, which was a stark contrast to her previously polished appearance. She fidgeted in her seat, shooting daggers at me across the room, as if daring me to acknowledge her. The judge entered, and the atmosphere became electric. Derek stood up to present Sarah's case, attempting to shift the focus back onto my parenting skills. Your Honor, my client wishes to remind the court of her dedication as a mother, despite the slanderous claims made by Mr. Turner. He has repeatedly demonstrated emotional volatility, and we believe it is detrimental to the children's well-being to be in his custody. I braced myself, knowing that Sarah's friends had been feeding Derek some juicy evidence of my supposed instability. But I had anticipated this and prepared my counter-arguments. Your Honor, I'd like to address that, I interjected, rising from my seat. While it is true that I have had my challenges, my emotional state has nothing to do with my ability to provide a stable environment for my children. Sarah's attempts to divert attention away from her actions only demonstrate her unwillingness to take responsibility. The judge nodded, her expression serious. Mr. Turner, please provide evidence supporting your claims of stability. I had come prepared. I pulled out letters of recommendation from my boss, colleagues, and even a few parents from the school, all praising my commitment as a father and my role in the community. I have been actively involved in my children's lives, ensuring they have everything they need, I said, handing the documents to the judge. Sarah, on the other hand, has been neglecting her responsibilities and prioritizing her social life over our children. After reviewing the evidence, the judge turned her attention back to Sarah. Ms. Turner, do you have anything to add in response to these statements and documents? Sarah hesitated, glancing at Derek for guidance. Your Honor, I just need some time to adjust. The pressure has been overwhelming, and I believe my circumstances have affected my parenting. But I can improve. The judge's gaze narrowed. Your circumstances? Your choices have led to this situation. If you wish to regain custody, you must demonstrate significant change and commitment. Derek looked flustered as Sarah fumbled her words. I will show you. I promise. The judge leaned back in her chair, clearly unimpressed. Very well. I expect to see substantial evidence of your progress in our next hearing. Otherwise, I will consider full custody arrangements for Mr. Turner. With that, the hearing was adjourned, and as we left the courtroom, I felt a surge of triumph. Rebecca smiled at me, clearly pleased with how the day had gone. You're making a strong case, John. Sarah's grasping at straws, and it's showing. But as I stepped outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah wouldn't give up easily. I turned to Rebecca, my mind racing. She's going to try something desperate. We need to stay ahead of her. As we walked towards the parking lot, I spotted Sarah speaking with a few of her friends, including Jenna. They were whispering and casting glances in my direction, and I could sense that they were concocting something. I decided to keep my distance but made a mental note to stay vigilant. That night, I received an unexpected call from Mike. Hey, I just heard something that might interest you. Sarah's been out with some new friends, and they're all talking about a big plan to take you down. Really? I felt my heart race. What are they planning? They're trying to dig up dirt on you. They think they can paint you as the villain in this story. I think they might even be planning to confront you publicly. I ran a hand through my hair, feeling a mix of annoyance and intrigue. Do you think they'll go through with it? Knowing Sarah, I wouldn't put it past her, Mike replied. I'll keep an ear to the ground. Just be careful. The next few days were tense as I waited for Sarah's next move. I worked with Rebecca to strengthen my case, gathering more evidence and witnesses, all while keeping a close eye on Sarah's social media. I knew she was capable of making reckless choices, and I was determined to be ready for anything. Finally, the day of the next hearing arrived, and I felt a sense of anticipation in the air. As I walked into the courthouse, I could see Sarah seated at her table, looking more put together than before, as if she had been preparing for something dramatic. Once the judge entered, Sarah stood up, taking everyone by surprise. Your Honor, I'd like to present new evidence, she declared, her voice shaking but filled with determination. The judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Proceed, Ms. Turner. Sarah pulled out a series of photos from her bag and handed them to the judge. These show John in compromising situations, at parties, drinking, and with other women. He's not the devoted father he claims to be. He is trying to paint me as the bad guy when he is the one neglecting our children. Gasps erupted in the courtroom, and I felt my heart drop. I glanced at Rebecca, who looked equally stunned. She's resorting to lies? I whispered. The judge scrutinized the photos. Mr. Turner, how do you respond to these allegations? I took a deep breath, realizing that this was a pivotal moment. Your Honor, while those photos might seem incriminating, they are misleading and taken out of context. I have been out with friends occasionally, but I have never neglected my responsibilities as a father. In fact, I have evidence proving my involvement in my children's lives, as well as witness statements to back my claims. Derek jumped in, trying to capitalize on Sarah's audacity. Your Honor, it's clear that Mr. Turner is attempting to deflect attention from his behavior. He's hiding behind his children while neglecting his duties as a husband and father. I leaned forward, determined to take control. Your Honor, this is a smear tactic meant to distract from the truth. I have consistently put my children first and have evidence to support that. The judge glanced between us, clearly seeing the tension in the room. Ms. Turner, she said finally, this court expects honesty and integrity. If these photos are indeed misleading and taken out of context, it will reflect poorly on you. I suggest you tread carefully. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, and I could see the confidence draining from Sarah's face. But just as I thought I had the upper hand, she looked at her friends and then back at the judge. I'm not done yet. I have witnesses who can back my story. Before I could respond, She called over Jenna and another friend named Lisa to the stand. My heart raced as I realized I had underestimated Sarah's ability to rally her supporters. "Your Honor," Jenna began, her voice shaky but earnest. "I've seen John at parties, drinking and leaving his kids alone. It's not safe for them to be with him." Lisa jumped in, nodding vigorously. "He can be emotionally unstable. Sarah has had to deal with a lot of his outbursts." I clenched my fists, feeling anger bubbling inside me. I had known this was coming, but hearing their fabricated tales was infuriating. The judge listened intently, her brow furrowed in thought. I knew I had to counter this narrative with everything I had. As Jenna and Lisa continued to spin their stories, I whispered to Rebecca, "We need to bring in witnesses who can attest to Sarah's neglect." "Already on it," she replied, her expression determined. "I've reached out to parents from the kids' school who have seen her behavior firsthand. If we can get them to testify, it will dismantle their claims." The tension in the room continued to build as Sarah's friends finished their testimony. But just when I thought things couldn't get any more intense, Sarah made an unexpected move. "Your Honor, I have one more witness to call," she exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with a mix of desperation and hope. "Who is this witness?" the judge asked, her tone skeptical. "Greg. He can confirm everything I've said about John's behavior," Sarah declared triumphantly, her voice ringing through the courtroom. My heart sank as I realized the implications. Greg was not just a casual acquaintance. He was the man who had been seeing Sarah throughout our separation. He could potentially sway the judge's opinion with his fabricated stories. The judge nodded, clearly intrigued. "Bring him in." As I sat in stunned silence, my mind raced with thoughts. I had to think fast. If Greg took the stand, I could lose everything. But then it struck me this was my chance to turn the tables. If I could expose Greg's motivations and his connection to Sarah, it could unravel her entire narrative. As Greg walked in, a wave of arrogance surrounded him. He smirked as he took his seat, and I felt the fire ignite within me. This wasn't over yet. I had to make sure Sarah's plan backfired spectacularly. The judge looked at Greg, ready to hear his testimony. I leaned forward, ready to expose the truth. It was time to take control of the courtroom once and for all. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Greg took the stand, casting a smug glance at Sarah. He settled into his seat, seemingly reveling in the attention. "Your Honor," he began, "I've known Sarah for a long time, and I can confirm that John is not the father he claims to be. He's been emotionally unstable, and Sarah has had to step in to keep everything together." I felt a surge of indignation but kept my composure. "Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine this witness," I said, rising from my seat. "Proceed," the judge replied, her eyes focused on me. "Greg, how long have you known Sarah?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "Since high school," he replied, his confidence unwavering. "And during that time, you were aware that she was married, correct?" I pressed, leaning forward slightly. "Of course," he replied, seemingly unfazed. I glanced at Sarah, who was nervously tapping her fingers on the table, her facade of confidence beginning to crack. "You and Sarah became involved while she was still married to me, is that right?" I asked, letting the implication hang in the air. His expression faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "That's not what this is about. It's about the kids." "Is it?" I challenged. "Or is it about covering up your own involvement in this mess? Wouldn't you agree that your relationship with my wife compromises your credibility as a witness?" The judge's brow furrowed as she took in the exchange. "Mr. Bennett, do you have a response to that?" Greg shifted uncomfortably. "I'm here to support Sarah and her claims. I've seen John's behavior firsthand." "Let's talk about that behavior," I said, seizing the opportunity. "You claim to have witnessed me neglecting my children. Can you specify a time when you saw this happening?" He stammered, clearly caught off guard. "Exactly," I interrupted. "You're making claims without evidence, all while trying to protect your own interests in this situation. You're romantically involved with my wife, and yet you're here to offer an unbiased perspective? How convenient for both of you." The judge looked skeptical, her eyes narrowing as she considered the implications. Mr. Bennett, it seems your relationship with Ms. Turner is indeed relevant here. Would you say it influences your perspective on Mr. Turner's parenting? Greg shifted uncomfortably again, his confident demeanor fading. No, I mean yes, but let's focus on the facts, I urged. If you truly care about the well-being of my children, wouldn't you want to ensure they are in the best possible environment? And wouldn't that mean keeping your romantic entanglement out of this courtroom? The judge nodded, clearly intrigued by my line of questioning. Mr. Bennett, I remind you that you're under oath. Do you understand the implications of your testimony? Greg's bravado dissipated. Your Honor, I think it's clear that Greg is here not to testify on behalf of the children, but to support his own interests and those of my wife, I concluded, looking pointedly at Sarah. He is not a credible witness, and any claims he makes should be disregarded. The judge considered this for a moment, then turned her gaze to Greg. Mr. Bennett, if your involvement with Ms. Turner has influenced your perspective, I will expect you to step down from the witness stand. We need to prioritize the children's best interests here. Greg's face fell as the weight of the situation hit him. That's not fair. I'm just trying to help. The judge's voice was firm. You can help by being honest. If you cannot provide impartial testimony, I suggest you leave the stand. With that, Greg huffed in frustration and stepped down, his arrogance replaced by uncertainty. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I turned to Sarah, who was visibly shaken. Your Honor, I said, taking the opportunity to further solidify my position. I'd like to call my witnesses who can attest to Sarah's neglect and my commitment as a father. The judge nodded, allowing me to proceed. I called in several parents from the school, each one sharing their perspective on Sarah's involvement, or lack thereof, in our children's lives. One mother, Lisa, spoke up first. I've seen John at every school event, helping with fundraisers and volunteering. Sarah has shown up sporadically, and it's often just to make an appearance. The children need consistency. Another father chimed in. I've had multiple conversations with John. He's always focused on what's best for his kids. Sarah often seems distracted or preoccupied with her own life. With each testimony, I could feel the tide shifting further in my favor. The judge took notes, her expression serious as she processed the information. Finally, I called my last witness, Mike. As he took the stand, I could see the determination in his eyes. Your Honor, I've known John for years. He's not just a great father. He's a committed family man. He's always put his children first. The judge listened intently as Mike recounted stories of our family's life, highlighting moments where I had gone above and beyond as a father. Sarah, on the other hand, has made choices that reflect poorly on her commitment to the family. She's often out with friends instead of prioritizing her children. As Mike finished his testimony, I felt a rush of gratitude. The support I was receiving from my friends and the community was overwhelming, and it reinforced my belief that I was doing the right thing. Once Mike finished, the judge turned to Sarah. Ms. Turner, do you have any response to the testimonies we've heard today? Sarah hesitated, clearly flustered. I just need more time. I'm going through a lot. Your personal struggles do not negate your responsibilities as a mother, the judge replied, her tone stern. It seems you have a long road ahead if you wish to regain custody. As the hearing adjourned, I felt a sense of victory. I had weathered the storm, and for the first time, it seemed like justice was on my side. I stepped outside the courtroom with Rebecca, my heart pounding with hope. Do you think that went well? I asked, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. Rebecca smiled, her confidence reassuring. You nailed it, John. You have the evidence and the support. Sarah's game is unraveling, and it's only a matter of time before the truth comes out. But just as I was starting to feel optimistic, I spotted Sarah in the hallway, whispering urgently to Derek and Greg. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that this fight was far from over. Sarah wasn't ready to give up just yet, and I had no doubt she would strike back in a way that I couldn't predict. I turned to Rebecca, my heart racing. We need to be prepared for whatever she throws at us next. I can't let her destroy everything I've worked for." Rebecca nodded, her expression serious. "Agreed. Let's regroup and strategize. We're in this together." As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I knew that Sarah was capable of anything, and I needed to stay one step ahead. With the battle lines drawn, I was ready for whatever came next. As I settled into bed that night, my mind raced with thoughts of the day's events. I felt a mix of triumph and unease, knowing Sarah was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. The courtroom victory had been significant, but I was acutely aware that she was unpredictable, fueled by desperation and anger. The following day, I met up with Mike at a local coffee shop to discuss our strategy. "I think we need to be proactive," I said, sipping my black coffee. "Sarah will come back swinging, and I want to make sure we're ready." Mike nodded. "Absolutely. I've been doing some digging into her recent activities. She's been trying to rally her friends, and word is she's reaching out to old connections to find dirt on you." I leaned in, my interest piqued. "What do you mean by old connections?" "She's been in touch with some people from high school, trying to dig up any scandalous stories that might portray you in a bad light," he explained. "One of them mentioned she's even considering talking to some of your old friends." I frowned, feeling a mixture of anger and disbelief. Why would she think that would work? We've moved on from those days. "Desperate times call for desperate measures," Mike replied, his tone serious. "We need to counter this before it gains traction. If she gets her hands on anything that could tarnish your reputation, it could turn the tide." Determined not to let her succeed, I decided to take action. "Let's contact a few of my old friends and fill them in on the situation. I want them to be prepared in case Sarah reaches out." As we discussed potential witnesses and strategies, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Rebecca. "I think Sarah's planning something big. We need to meet." I excused myself and headed over to her apartment, feeling a mix of apprehension and curiosity. When I arrived, Rebecca was pacing, her face etched with concern. "I just got off the phone with Jenna. She said Sarah's been posting cryptic messages online, hinting at some big reveal." "What kind of reveal?" I asked, my heart racing. "She's making it sound like she has a bombshell that will change everything," Rebecca replied, crossing her arms. "It's all very vague, but I have a feeling it's going to involve some personal attack on you. She's trying to manipulate the narrative again." "Great," I muttered, feeling my frustration boil over. "What's her plan this time?" "I don't know, but we need to get ahead of it. We should have our own narrative ready to counter whatever she throws at us," Rebecca suggested, her voice steady. We brainstormed ideas and decided that we needed to document my involvement in the children's lives more thoroughly. "Let's put together a presentation of your activities, including photos and testimonials from the kids' teachers and friends," Rebecca said. "We can show how committed you are." That night, we worked late into the evening, compiling evidence, sorting through photos, and contacting other parents. I wanted to be prepared for whatever Sarah had planned, and I was determined to protect my children at all costs. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that hung in the air. Sarah was relentless, and I knew that she would stop at nothing to maintain her facade. I started to question whether I truly knew her at all. As the days passed, Sarah's online posts became more dramatic and sensational. She crafted a narrative of a wronged woman fighting against a manipulative husband, garnering sympathy from her friends and followers. The comments flooded in, with many expressing support for her. It was as if she was preparing for a battle in the court of public opinion, and I needed to counter that narrative before it took on a life of its own. One evening, while scrolling through social media, I stumbled upon a post that made my blood run cold. It was a photo of Sarah and Greg, taken at a restaurant, both of them smiling, with the caption, "New beginnings, #no looking back, #happy times." My heart sank as I realized what this meant. She was trying to paint the picture that she was moving on, but it was clear that this was all part of her plan to manipulate the narrative. I immediately texted Rebecca, sharing my discovery. "This is not good," she replied. She's trying to establish herself as the victim who has found happiness. We need to nip this in the bud. I'll reach out to Mike, I said, feeling a sense of urgency. We need to get our counter-narrative out there before this gains momentum. I called Mike, who was just as frustrated. Let's set up a meeting with our friends who have been supportive. We need to brainstorm how to counter her story and get the truth out there. Over the next few days, we organized a gathering at my house, inviting a small group of trusted friends who understood the situation. When they arrived, I laid out my plan. Sarah is trying to control the narrative, and we need to make sure she doesn't succeed. We need to highlight the truth, my involvement with the kids and the lies she's been spreading. As we discussed various strategies, one of my friends, Karen, spoke up. What if we organized a community event? Something that showcases your dedication as a father and helps others in similar situations. It could shift the focus back to what really matters, the kids. I loved the idea and quickly rallied my friends to help organize a community fundraiser for the local children's shelter, where all the proceeds would go to helping families in need. This is exactly what we need, I said, my spirits lifting. It will demonstrate that I'm not just a father. I'm a community man who cares about more than just myself. As we started making plans, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah would retaliate, but I was ready for the challenge. The event would take place in 2 weeks, giving us enough time to gather support and promote it within the community. However, as the days passed, I began to receive anonymous messages on social media, each one more hostile than the last. You'll regret this, one read. Your past will come back to haunt you. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Was this Sarah's doing? It seemed like she was becoming increasingly desperate, and the idea that she might try to sabotage the fundraiser crossed my mind. That night, I confided in Rebecca about the messages. This isn't just a petty feud anymore. She's willing to resort to intimidation tactics. Rebecca's expression hardened. We can't let her scare us. We're doing this for the kids, and we have to stay focused. But we should also inform the authorities about these threats. I agreed, knowing that I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. Together, we reported the messages to the police, documenting everything, determined to stay one step ahead of Sarah. As the day of the fundraiser approached, excitement buzzed in the air. Friends and community members rallied behind the event, sharing it on social media and inviting others to participate. But deep down, I felt an unsettling anticipation, knowing that Sarah would not sit idly by while I reclaimed my narrative. On the day of the fundraiser, I arrived early to set up, surrounded by friends who were enthusiastic and eager to help. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter and hope. But as I looked around, I noticed a shadow lurking at the edge of the park where we were hosting the event. My heart raced as I realized it was Sarah. She was talking to Greg and a few other acquaintances, her expression unreadable. I approached Rebecca, my voice low. Sarah's here. I don't like this. She turned to look. Let's keep an eye on her. If she tries anything, we'll be ready. As the event kicked off, I took a moment to speak to the crowd, thanking everyone for their support. I emphasized my commitment to my children and the community, sharing stories about my experiences as a father. The crowd applauded, and I felt a swell of pride. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sarah approaching the makeshift stage. My stomach dropped. "Excuse me, everyone," she called, her voice dripping with feigned sweetness. "I have something to say." The crowd turned, confusion spreading as they watched her stride confidently toward me. "I couldn't let this event go by without addressing the elephant in the room," she continued, her tone shifting from friendly to confrontational. "It's amazing how John can put on a show for everyone, pretending to be the perfect dad. But what he won't tell you is how he's really been neglecting our kids." Gasps rippled through the crowd as she launched into her attack, painting me as the irresponsible parent. "He's been more interested in his social life than being there for our children," she claimed. "I've tried to keep it together, but he's the one causing the problems." I felt a surge of anger but knew I had to stay calm. "Sarah, this isn't the time or place for this," I said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "This is about the kids and helping families in need." But she pressed on, her voice growing louder. You all deserve to know the truth. He's not the father you think he is." The crowd began to murmur, and I could feel the atmosphere shifting. I had to act quickly. "Sarah, if you truly cared about our children, you wouldn't be using this event to air your grievances." I countered, my voice steady. "This is not about us. It's about the kids." She paused for a moment, taken aback by my response. I seized the opportunity. "I've invited friends and family here to support our children and help families in need. I've been there for our kids, attending every school function, helping with homework, and being present in their lives. You, on the other hand, have made choices that reflect poorly on your commitment to them." The crowd was silent, tension thick in the air as they processed the exchange. I glanced at Rebecca, who was watching intently, ready to support me if needed. As I turned back to Sarah, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. "You can't just manipulate everyone into believing you're the good guy," she shouted, her composure crumbling. "I'm not manipulating anyone," I replied firmly. "I'm sharing the truth. And the truth is, our children need stability and support, not this public spectacle." I felt the tide turning as more people in the crowd began to side with me. Whispers of support rippled through the audience, and I could see Sarah's face reddening in frustration. "Enough," I declared, raising my voice. "If you want to discuss our children's welfare, let's do it in private and with respect, not in front of an audience. This is supposed to be a celebration of community and support, not a battleground for our personal issues." With that, I stepped back, allowing the crowd to absorb what had just unfolded. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as people began to rally around me, applauding my commitment and integrity. Sarah's expression darkened, and I knew I had struck a nerve. But this wasn't over. She wouldn't take this defeat lying down. As the event continued, I focused on the positive energy in the park, enjoying the support from my friends and the community. But in the back of my mind, I remained vigilant, aware that Sarah was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for her next move. The battle had intensified, but I was determined to stay the course, not just for myself, but for my children and the future we all deserved. As the fundraiser continued, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. My friends and community rallied around me, determined to show that we were united. But in the back of my mind, I was acutely aware of Sarah's potential for sabotage. She wouldn't take kindly to the setback I had just dealt her, and I couldn't afford to be complacent. Over the next few days, the atmosphere grew tense. The fundraiser had generated a lot of attention, and Sarah had continued to stir the pot on social media. She shared posts that twisted the narrative in her favor, portraying herself as a victim of my supposed manipulation. Each post garnered more sympathy and support, and I could feel the mounting pressure. I met with Mike and Rebecca to discuss our next steps. "We need to counter her narrative effectively," I insisted. "If we don't, her lies will start to gain traction. I've been tracking her posts, and it's clear she's trying to paint you as the villain," Mike said, tapping his phone screen. "But we have a chance to turn this around if we act fast." Rebecca suggested creating a video that showcased the reality of my involvement with our children. "We can include interviews from their teachers, friends, and even neighbors who can attest to your character," she proposed. "It will provide a stark contrast to Sarah's narrative." We spent hours planning the video, ensuring it accurately portrayed my commitment as a father and a member of the community. We set a date to film it, and I felt a surge of hope. If we could put out a compelling message, it might help to counteract Sarah's manipulations. On the day of filming, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. The sun shone brightly, and my children were excited to be involved. We shot scenes in the park, playing games and engaging in activities that highlighted our bond. The joy on their faces was genuine, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. However, as we wrapped up the filming, I received an anonymous tip about Sarah's latest scheme. It seemed she was planning to stage a public meltdown, claiming I had been abusive and neglectful. My heart sank as I realized the lengths she was willing to go to discredit me. "This is serious," I said to Rebecca and Mike. "We need to be ready for anything." As I left the park that day, I spotted Sarah in the distance, talking animatedly with Greg. A wave of anger surged through me, but I knew I had to keep my cool. I called Mike and filled him in on what I'd learned. "We have to get this video out as soon as possible," I said. "It may be our only shot at staying ahead of her." After we finished editing the video, we launched it online, sharing it across multiple platforms. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many in the community rallying behind me. However, I knew Sarah wouldn't sit idly by. Just days after the video's release, Sarah escalated her campaign. She began posting videos of her own, showing staged emotional breakdowns, claiming she was terrified for her children's safety. Each video was more dramatic than the last, and I could see the impact it was having on social media. People began to rally around her, and my heart raced with frustration. "We need to do something," I told Rebecca. "This is getting out of hand." "Let's not react impulsively," she advised. "We need to gather evidence of her behavior. If she's staging these meltdowns, we can expose her for who she really is." So we decided to document everything. Mike and I began compiling screenshots of Sarah's posts, noting the dates and times. We also reached out to neighbors and friends who could provide testimonies about her erratic behavior. I even hired a private investigator to monitor her activities discreetly, hoping to catch her in the act. Meanwhile, the children began to notice the tension. My son, Jake, approached me one afternoon. "Dad, why is Mommy saying bad things about you online? I thought you were friends." My heart ached at his innocence. "It's complicated, buddy. Sometimes grown-ups don't see things the same way. But I want you to know I love you very much. You can always talk to me about anything." As we continued to gather evidence, Sarah's antics became more outrageous. She staged a scene in front of our children's school, accusing me of harassment and making a scene that attracted attention from the media. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to Mike, watching the news coverage from the comfort of my living room. "This is exactly what we've been waiting for," Mike said. "Let's show how far she's willing to go. We'll counter her story with the truth and all the evidence we've gathered." We compiled everything into a comprehensive report, detailing Sarah's behavior, the staged incidents, and how she was manipulating the situation for her gain. I consulted with my attorney, who advised that we file a motion for full custody, supported by the evidence we had gathered. The day we filed the motion, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This was a pivotal moment, one that could change everything. I knew that Sarah would fight back, but I was ready. In the days leading up to the hearing, the media frenzy continued. Sarah's posts had gone viral, and the narrative she spun was still gaining traction. But this time, I was determined to make the truth known. As the court date approached, I found myself steeling my resolve. I spent hours going over my testimony, rehearsing the points I wanted to make. Rebecca and Mike stood by me, offering their support and encouragement. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed with onlookers and media representatives eager to hear the drama unfold. Sarah looked composed, dressed in a sharp suit, but I could see the tension beneath her facade. When the judge entered the room, a hush fell over the crowd. I took a deep breath as the proceedings began. Sarah's attorney presented her case first, spinning tales of how I was an unfit father, all while portraying her as a devoted mother. As I sat there, I could feel the eyes of the audience on me, waiting for my turn. When my attorney called me to the stand, I felt a surge of confidence. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady, "I am here to present the truth, not only for myself but for my children." I shared the evidence we had collected, detailing Sarah's erratic behavior, her manipulative tactics, and how they impacted our children. I saw Sarah shift in her seat, the confidence she exuded beginning to waver. Then, I presented the video we had filmed at the fundraiser, showcasing the joy and love I shared with my children. The room fell silent as the video played, showing the bond we had formed despite the chaos surrounding us. As I finished my testimony, I looked directly at the judge. "I am committed to my children's well-being, and I believe that full custody is in their best interest." Sarah's attorney attempted to counter my claims, but I had a trump card. I presented the private investigator's report, which documented her staged incidents and erratic behavior over the past few weeks. The judge's eyebrows raised, and I could see the surprise ripple through the courtroom. The atmosphere shifted as the judge absorbed the evidence. Sarah's carefully crafted narrative began to crumble, and I felt a flicker of hope. But I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. As the hearing progressed, Sarah took the stand. Her demeanor had changed. Gone was the confident woman who had walked in. She seemed flustered, and I couldn't help but notice the cracks in her facade. "John is trying to turn our children against me," she claimed, her voice shaky. "He's manipulating them and this whole situation for his gain. Is that why you've been publicly attacking him online?" I interjected, my voice firm. "Or is it because you're afraid of losing control?" The judge leaned forward, intrigued. "Mr. Smith, please allow Ms. Harris to speak without interruptions." I nodded, but my heart raced. I knew I had to keep my composure. This was my chance to shine light on the truth. As Sarah continued her testimony, it became clear that she was fabricating stories. I felt a surge of anger as she spun a web of lies, but I held my tongue, waiting for my opportunity to respond. After her testimony concluded, my attorney called a few character witnesses to the stand. Friends and neighbors spoke glowingly about my commitment to my children, contrasting Sarah's erratic behavior. The tide was turning. Then, in a moment I had not anticipated, one of Sarah's old friends, Jenna, was called to the stand. I hadn't expected this, and my stomach twisted in knots as she took her seat. "Jenna, can you speak to Sarah's behavior leading up to the divorce?" my attorney asked. Jenna hesitated before answering, glancing nervously at Sarah. "Well, I've seen her change a lot since the separation. She's been different. It's like she's trying to prove something to everyone." The courtroom fell silent, and I could feel Sarah's eyes burn into Jenna. "What do you mean by different?" my attorney probed. "She's been much more focused on her image and how she appears to others. She staged a lot of her meltdowns for attention," Jenna admitted, her voice quavering. I didn't want to get involved, but I felt like it was time to tell the truth. The room erupted in whispers, and I felt a rush of vindication. This was the moment I had been waiting for, the validation of my experiences. As Jenna's testimony sank in, Sarah's face paled. I could see the realization dawning on her that her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, and I felt a surge of confidence. My attorney continued to press for details. "What do you know about Sarah's online behavior and how it has affected her children?" Jenna took a deep breath. "I've seen her post things that weren't true. She seemed more concerned with getting sympathy from others than focusing on her kids. I think it was hurting them." Sarah shot Jenna a furious glance, but the damage was done. The judge nodded, clearly taking note of Jenna's revelations. Once Jenna's testimony concluded, I felt a renewed sense of hope. I knew we were gaining ground, but I still needed to keep the momentum going. My attorney called for a recess, allowing everyone to gather their thoughts. As I stepped outside the courtroom, I saw Rebecca waiting for me. "You did great. I think we're turning the tide," she said, a proud smile on her face. "Let's hope it lasts," I replied, still feeling the weight of uncertainty. But I know Sarah won't take this lying down. When we returned to the courtroom, Sarah appeared visibly shaken. Her composure was gone, and I could see the fear in her eyes. I knew this was my chance to capitalize on her weakness. As the hearing resumed, Sarah's attorney attempted to regain control of the narrative, but it was clear the tide had shifted. "Your Honor, my client is clearly distressed. She is under emotional duress, which has led to these outbursts," her attorney argued. "But is that distress justified?" the judge retorted. "It seems to me that the real issue here is the well-being of the children, not the emotional state of the parent." I couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. The judge's words echoed my thoughts precisely. The hearing continued, and I watched as Sarah's attorney struggled to reestablish her credibility. They called a psychologist to the stand, who attempted to paint Sarah as the devoted mother who was just overwhelmed by the pressures of parenting and the divorce. However, as the psychologist answered questions, I noticed inconsistencies in her statements. I had my chance when my attorney asked if Sarah had ever sought help for her behavior prior to the divorce. No, the psychologist admitted. But it's common for parents in high-stress situations to exhibit erratic behavior. Is it also common for a parent to stage public meltdowns for sympathy? I interjected, feeling emboldened. The psychologist faltered. Well, that's not typical behavior, but exactly. I pressed, sensing I was onto something. It's not typical, and that's what concerns me. Our children deserve a stable environment, and Sarah has shown she is incapable of providing that. The audience murmured, and I felt a rush of adrenaline. I had put Sarah on the defensive, and she knew it. As the day wore on, Sarah's demeanor shifted from defiance to desperation. She made one last attempt to regain control, addressing the judge directly. Your Honor, I'm not a bad mother. I've made mistakes, but I love my children. I just need help. Help for what? The judge replied. It seems you're using your children as pawns in a game that only serves your interests. The judge's words hung in the air like a guillotine, cutting through Sarah's facade. I felt a flicker of hope as the reality of her situation settled in. As the hearing wrapped up for the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had finally turned a corner. The judge had clearly seen through Sarah's lies, and the mounting evidence was working in my favor. But I knew the battle wasn't over. Sarah was still a formidable opponent. That night, I gathered with Mike and Rebecca to discuss our next steps. We need to prepare for her inevitable retaliation, I said, my voice steady. She's going to strike back, and we have to be ready. I've been monitoring her social media, Mike chimed in. She's already planning another public event to try to garner sympathy. We should have a counter-event ready. Good idea, Rebecca said. We can host a community gathering, showcasing the support for you as a father. It'll send a clear message that you're not alone in this. We spent hours brainstorming, crafting a plan to organize a community picnic to celebrate fatherhood and family. We would invite local families, friends, and supporters, creating a positive atmosphere to counteract Sarah's negativity. As the days passed, Sarah's posts grew increasingly frantic. She staged another public confrontation, this time at a local coffee shop, claiming I had threatened her and was trying to undermine her role as a mother. I couldn't believe the lengths she was willing to go to maintain her victim narrative. But we were ready. The community picnic was a huge success, drawing families and friends from all over. As I looked around, seeing the smiling faces of children and their parents, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I was not alone. I had a support system that believed in me. In a surprising twist, Jenna showed up at the picnic. She approached me, a look of sincerity in her eyes. I'm sorry for how I handled things, but I want to help you. I can't let Sarah manipulate the situation any longer. I was taken aback but grateful. Thank you, Jenna. Your support means a lot, and I appreciate your willingness to help. As the event continued, I could feel the tide shifting even more in my favor. The local media covered the picnic, highlighting the sense of community and support for fathers. The narrative was changing, and Sarah was losing her grip. As the weeks unfolded, the community picnic gained traction, and I continued to receive support from friends and neighbors. Sarah, on the other hand, grew increasingly agitated, her social media posts becoming more desperate and unhinged. Her online presence was a whirlwind of emotional outbursts, crying videos, and exaggerated tales of her supposed victimhood. It was painful to watch, especially knowing the toll it was taking on our children. Meanwhile, Jenna had become an invaluable ally. She had connections with some local influencers who were willing to amplify my story. We need to get the truth out there, she said one day while we were brainstorming. If we can show people that you're a dedicated father, it'll counteract everything Sarah's been saying. We organized a series of interviews with local news outlets, showcasing my commitment to my children. I shared stories about our family adventures, the challenges I faced as a single father, and how important it was for me to provide a stable home for them. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and I felt a renewed sense of hope. However, I knew Sarah wouldn't take this lying down. I received word that she was planning a massive public rally to demand justice, rallying her supporters to paint herself as the wronged party. I could almost hear the drums of war beating in the distance. As the day of her rally approached, I felt a mix of anxiety and determination. I knew I had to attend, but I wanted to be strategic. I gathered my supporters and prepared for what could potentially be a confrontational situation. On the day of the rally, the atmosphere was electric. Sarah's supporters were out in full force, holding signs and chanting slogans. But I had my own team, ready to counter her narrative peacefully. As the rally began, Sarah took to the stage, her demeanor full of bravado. She spoke passionately about her struggles and painted me as the villain in her story. But I was ready. With Jenna and my friends, we set up a booth nearby, handing out flyers and sharing our side of the story. I addressed the crowd, speaking about the importance of truth and integrity in parenting. We're here to support our children, not tear each other down. I shouted, my voice ringing out over the noise. The tension in the air was palpable as the two sides clashed. Sarah's supporters shouted back, but I could see doubt beginning to creep into their eyes. My team was passionate, and our message of love and support for our children was resonating. As I spoke, I noticed Sarah watching me from the stage, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. It was clear she hadn't anticipated my presence, and the power of community was beginning to shift the atmosphere. I know there are people here who care about the truth, I continued. This isn't about us. It's about our kids and their future. We owe it to them to rise above this conflict. The crowd began to murmur in agreement, and I could see some of Sarah's supporters starting to waver. The momentum was shifting, and I felt a surge of hope. Suddenly, a commotion broke out near the front of the stage. A young woman pushed through the crowd, holding her phone up. "I have evidence," she shouted, and the crowd fell silent, all eyes on her. It was a video of Sarah's latest staged meltdown. The footage showed her in a moment of vulnerability, but it also revealed her rehearsing her lines and adjusting her makeup before going live. The crowd gasped as the truth unfolded before them. The woman continued, "She's been manipulating all of you." The crowd began to murmur, and I could see Sarah's face drain of color. "What do you have to say for yourself, Sarah?" someone yelled from the crowd. Sarah's composure shattered in an instant. "That's not true," she shouted, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. I'm just trying to protect my children." The crowd was no longer convinced. I stepped forward, my heart pounding. This isn't about protection. It's about manipulation and control. Our children deserve better than this. The tide had completely turned. People began to step back from Sarah, murmurs of doubt spreading through her supporters. I felt a wave of triumph wash over me, but I also knew we weren't finished yet. As the rally continued, Sarah tried to regain control, but her voice was drowned out by the growing discontent among her followers. People began to shout back, demanding the truth and questioning her motives. "Enough is enough," someone shouted. "You can't keep lying to us." I seized the moment and turned to my supporters. "We're not here to fight. We're here to support each other and our children. We must stand for what's right, not just for ourselves but for the future of our families." With that, the crowd erupted in cheers, and I could see the momentum swinging in my favor. Sarah stood there, visibly shaken, and I knew this was the beginning of the end for her manipulation. As the rally wrapped up, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The community had seen through Sarah's lies, and I had the evidence to back it up. We had turned the tide, and I knew I was closer than ever to regaining control of my life. In the days that followed the rally, I felt a surge of optimism. The media coverage had shifted significantly, with many outlets portraying Sarah as the manipulative figure she had become. It was bittersweet to see her painted in this light, but I had to remind myself that my focus was on the well-being of our children. I continued to meet with my attorney, who encouraged me to keep gathering evidence to support my custody claim. "We need to maintain the momentum," she advised. "Your children deserve a stable home, free from manipulation and chaos." I spent time with my children, doing my best to reassure them during this tumultuous time. "Daddy loves you both so much," I told them. We're going to get through this together. But Sarah wasn't finished yet. She reached out to the media, trying to spin the narrative back in her favor. I watched in disbelief as she continued to portray herself as the victim, claiming I had turned the community against her. One afternoon, I received a call from Jenna, who had been doing some digging. "John, you won't believe what I found," she said, her voice urgent. "Sarah has been seeing a therapist, but not for the reasons you think. She's been using her sessions to build a narrative against you." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart racing. "She's been telling her therapist that you're abusive and that you've been manipulating the children against her. We need to find a way to expose this." I took a deep breath, knowing this could be a turning point. "Let's set up a meeting with my attorney. We have to act fast." As I met with my attorney and Jenna, we discussed how to use this information strategically. "If we can get Sarah's therapist to testify or provide documentation, it could strengthen your case," my attorney suggested. The plan was set in motion, and I felt a renewed sense of determination. We reached out to Sarah's therapist, requesting a meeting to discuss her claims. I knew this could be risky, but it was worth it if it meant protecting my children. As we waited for a response, I continued to focus on my children, maintaining a stable environment for them. I enrolled them in new activities, helping them make new friends and ensuring they felt loved and supported. One day, as I was picking them up from school, I received a call from my attorney. "John, we have a meeting scheduled with Sarah's therapist for next week," she said. "This could be our chance to get some clarity on her claims." "Thank you for setting this up," I replied, feeling a mix of anxiety and hope. "We need to know what she's been saying." The day of the meeting arrived, and I sat nervously in the waiting room. When the therapist finally entered, she seemed apprehensive but professional. We introduced ourselves and began discussing Sarah's treatment. "Sarah has mentioned feeling overwhelmed and has expressed fears about losing custody of her children," the therapist said cautiously. "But it's important to note that she has not presented any evidence of abuse." I leaned forward, my heart racing. "What about her claims that I'm manipulating our children? Is that something she's mentioned?" The therapist hesitated, her eyes shifting. "She has voiced concerns about your influence over them, but I found no evidence to support that. Could you provide a statement that reflects this?" I pressed. "It could be vital for the ongoing custody case." After a lengthy discussion, the therapist agreed to draft a statement outlining her observations. I felt a surge of relief. This could be the crucial evidence we needed. The following week, I received the therapist's statement, and it was more favorable than I had anticipated. It confirmed that Sarah's claims were baseless and highlighted her unstable behavior. I shared it with my attorney, who was equally thrilled. "This is a game changer," she said. "We can present this as evidence in court and counter all of Sarah's accusations." As we prepared for the upcoming court hearing, I felt a renewed sense of hope. The community had rallied around me, and the support was overwhelming. I focused on my children, ensuring they felt secure during this uncertain time. On the day of the hearing, the atmosphere in the courtroom was tense. Sarah entered, her demeanor still projecting defiance, but I could sense a shift in her confidence. I was determined to present the truth and protect my children. As my attorney presented the therapist's statement, I watched Sarah's expression change. The judge listened intently, and I could see the wheels turning in her mind. "Ms. Harris, do you have any evidence to support your claims against Mr. Smith?" the judge asked, her tone measured. Sarah stammered, clearly flustered. There are things he's done that I can't explain." "But you have no tangible evidence," the judge continued, glancing at my attorney. "Is that correct?" I felt a rush of adrenaline as the judge turned her attention to me. "Mr. Smith, would you like to respond?" I stood up, my heart pounding. "Your Honor, I have dedicated myself to being a loving and supportive father. I have never manipulated my children against their mother. My only goal is to provide them with a safe and nurturing environment." The judge nodded, her expression contemplative. "Thank you, Mr. Smith. I will take all this into consideration." The hearing continued, with both sides presenting their arguments. As the judge deliberated, I felt a mix of anxiety and anticipation. I knew the stakes were high, but I had faith in the evidence we had gathered. Finally, the moment arrived. The judge returned to the bench, and I held my breath, my heart racing. After careful consideration of the evidence presented, I find that there is insufficient proof to support the claims made by Ms. Harris regarding Mr. Smith's character, the judge stated firmly. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The judge continued, "Furthermore, I believe that it is in the best interest of the children to maintain a stable and loving environment, which Mr. Smith has demonstrated." Sarah's face fell, and I could see the reality of the situation sinking in. "Therefore, I am granting Mr. Smith full custody of the children," the judge concluded. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and I felt tears of joy welling up in my eyes. I couldn't believe it. I had fought so hard, and we had won. As I left the courtroom, my friends and supporters surrounded me, cheering and congratulating me. I felt a sense of gratitude and relief wash over me. The battle was finally over, and I had emerged victorious. But I knew this was just the beginning. The real work was in ensuring my children felt safe and loved in the aftermath of this ordeal. I took a deep breath and smiled at my children, who rushed to hug me. "We did it, Dad!" my daughter exclaimed, her eyes shining with joy. "Yes, we did," I replied, holding them close. "This is a new chapter for us, and we're going to be okay." In the weeks following the hearing, I focused on rebuilding our lives and fostering a sense of normalcy for my children. We spent quality time together, enjoying activities that strengthened our bond. I took them on weekend outings, exploring parks, museums, and local attractions. It was a joy to see them smile, and I cherished every moment. But even as I embraced this new chapter, I was acutely aware of the potential for Sarah to lash out. Her behavior had become erratic, and I had to remain vigilant. I kept my communication with her minimal, focusing solely on matters related to the children. One day, as I was picking up the kids from school, I received an unexpected message from Sarah. "I'm going to fight this decision," it read. "You haven't heard the last from me." A chill ran down my spine. I had anticipated this response, but seeing it in writing made it all the more real. I took a deep breath and reminded myself to stay calm. I had to prioritize my children's well-being. Later that evening, I discussed the situation with Rebecca and Mike. "She's not going to let this go easily," I said. "I need to be prepared for whatever she throws at me next." "Just stay focused on the kids," Mike advised. "You've got a solid support system, and we'll be here for you." "I appreciate that," I replied, feeling grateful for their friendship. As the days passed, Sarah's attempts to provoke me escalated. She began posting negative comments about me online, portraying me as an unfit father. It was disheartening, but I refused to engage. I knew the truth would shine through. Instead, I focused on documenting her behavior. I saved screenshots of her posts and any messages that could be relevant in the future. I wanted to protect myself and my children. Despite Sarah's attempts to undermine my efforts, my relationship with my children grew stronger. I made it a priority to be open and communicative with them, allowing them to express their feelings about the situation. One night, as we sat down for dinner, my son looked up. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I put down my fork, my heart aching for him. "Yes, buddy, we're going to be just fine," I reassured him, meeting his gaze. "It's normal to feel scared sometimes, especially after everything that's happened. But I'm here for you, and I'll always protect you and your sister." He nodded, but I could still see the worry etched on his face. "What if Mom tries to take us away again?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "I know it seems scary, but we're stronger now. We have a lot of people who care about us, and the most important thing is that you two are safe. I'll do everything I can to make sure that stays true." As I spoke, I felt a wave of determination wash over me. I would never let Sarah's manipulation tear apart the bond one had with my children. I would fight for them no matter what. In the following weeks, Sarah continued her campaign to undermine me. She escalated her online harassment, even going so far as to contact my employer with false claims about my character. I remained focused, determined not to let her tactics draw me into a confrontation. I knew I had to be the bigger person. One afternoon, I received a call from my attorney. "John, we need to address Sarah's online harassment," she said. "It's becoming a pattern, and we can use it to strengthen your case if she continues." I agreed, knowing that documentation was crucial. "I've been keeping records of everything," I replied. "I won't let her get away with this." As the weeks turned into months, the legal battle wore on. But with every challenge, my resolve only grew stronger. I sought therapy for myself and my children, understanding the importance of emotional support during such a turbulent time. I wanted us to heal together, and the therapist provided invaluable strategies for coping. "Remember, it's okay to feel what you're feeling," she told us during our sessions. "Processing these emotions is vital for your well-being." Then came a turning point. Sarah, realizing her tactics weren't working, attempted to negotiate a settlement. She reached out to me through her attorney, suggesting joint custody and a visitation schedule. After consulting with my attorney, I decided to consider the offer, but only on my terms. I wanted a structured agreement that prioritized our children's needs. When I presented my counteroffer, it included clear boundaries for Sarah's involvement and expectations for her behavior. To my surprise, she agreed to the terms without too much fuss. The final agreement included joint custody, but I had the primary residence of the children, ensuring their stability. I felt a surge of relief knowing I had protected their home environment. When the settlement was finalized, I gathered my children for a family meeting. "I want to tell you both that things are going to be okay," I said, my heart swelling with pride as I watched their expressions shift from worry to hope. "We're going to have a new routine, and we'll continue to make wonderful memories together." My son smiled, and my daughter leaned against me. "Can we go to the park this weekend?" she asked, her eyes sparkling. "Of course. We'll have a picnic and play games. It'll be a blast," I replied, feeling lighter than I had in months. As we made plans for the weekend, I realized that although the fight was challenging, it had only strengthened our family bond. I would always be there for my children, and together we would overcome anything that came our way. In the end, I learned that love, resilience, and the unwavering commitment to protect my children would always prevail over manipulation and fear. We were moving forward, ready to embrace whatever life had in store for us, together.